Good evening and welcome. Thanks for braving the cold and being here tonight. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Heather Campion, CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming and acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor Bank of America, Raytheon, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, Viacom, and WBUR. Robust biographies of each of our panelists are listed in your program, so I'll forgo repeating that information and briefly introduce our speakers in the context of the themes we hope to explore this evening. The great enemy of the truth, John F. Kennedy once reminded us, is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Julian Zelizer's new book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society, is premised on debunking certain historical myths, including the notion that the 1960s was the apex of modern American liberalism, when the federal government came to be seen as a positive good, when social movements leaned toward the left, and when conservatives were marginalized and irrelevant. His book seeks to show why those conclusions, often accepted by historians, are not entirely accurate, and he convincingly pierces another myth, the notion that the Great Society was single-handedly crafted by President Johnson through his command of congressional arcanery and his ability to twist arms and attract votes through the legendary Johnson treatment. All myths, of course, are based on some fact, and stories of the LBJ treatment abound. We're honored tonight to have Mark Shriver with us. Mark is the fourth child of Eunice and Sargent Shriver and currently serves as the Senior Vice President for Save the Children. And also with us is Mr. Shriver's biographer, Scott Stossel, editor of The Atlantic magazine. I thought it'd be fun to listen in to a conversation when President Johnson calls and surprises Sargent Shriver by telling him he's going to announce in just a few hours that he would be appointing Mr. Shriver to lead the war on poverty. Let's listen, and I provided a transcript for you to follow along.
Mark. Good morning, Mr. President. How are you?
I'm going to announce your appointment at press conference.
What press conference?
This afternoon.
Well, God, I think it would be advisable, if you don't mind, if I could have this weekend, I wanted to sit down with a couple of people and see what we could get in the way of some sort of a plan, because what happens, at least my thought is that what happens is that you announce somebody or hear somebody else, and they don't know what the hell they're doing or what the program's going to be specifically, and who's going to carry it. Then you're in a hell of a hole, because they start calling you up and saying, well, now, what are you going to do?
Well,
out and all that, and you don't
just don't talk to them. Just go away and go to Camp David. Figure it out. We need something to say to the press.
Could you just say that you've asked me to study this?
No, hell no. They've studied. They want to know who in the hell's going to do this, and it's leaked all over the papers for 2 weeks that you're going to do it, and they'll be shooting me with questions. They've already done it. And
what I'd like to do is to get that the way this is going to be so we integrated, so when we announce something, we're really ready to talk about it intelligently.
Well, I don't think you can do that until you make this whole study and you come up with a message, and all that'll go in the message. But I'm talking about the man that is evolving the organization and in charge of perfecting it right now. And his name is Sargent Shriver, and he still has his identification with the Peace Corps, and he will keep it to such extent as he deems desirable. And if you can't run a 100 million program in your left hand and a billion with your right hand, you're not as smart as I think you are.
This goes to a bombshell.
Not if you, hell, it'll be a promotion. You've got your identification with the Peace Corps. You've got everything you ever had there, plus this. I don't know why they would object to that. Unless you got some women that think you won't have enough time to spend with them. You got the responsibilities, you got the authority, you got the power, you got the money. Now, you may not have the glands.
The glands?
Yeah.
I got plenty of glands.
All right. Well, I haven't. That's one of mine. I'd like to have your glands, man. Yeah, but all you got to do is, I need Dr. Brinkley myself.
Yeah.
Some of those goat glands.
Yeah. Well, you feel that you've got to do it this afternoon?
I think I ought to. And I think if I want to keep you identified with the Peace Corps, I'm not. Because I've got a press conference at 3 o'clock. And it's announced.
Yeah.
And this is going to be the thing I tell them.
So since we're a history museum, let's set the record straight. Dr. John Brinkley made a national name for himself by transplanting goat testicles into humans as a means of curing male impotence, a Viagra salesman before his time. With the initial promise of his far-fetched remedy helped him amass a great fortune, he died penniless after losing a series of malpractice, wrongful death, and fraud suits that were brought against him. In all seriousness, there's one other myth that we'll explore in this evening's session. To introduce it, let me paraphrase from an excerpt from Nicholas Lemann's 1988 article, The Unfinished War, from the Atlantic Monthly. Ronald Reagan once proclaimed, "In the 60s, we waged a war on poverty, and poverty won." Most Americans would probably agree with him. There's a widespread perception that the federal government's effort to help the poor during the 60s were almost unlimited, that despite them, poverty became more severe, and that the reason poverty increased is that all those government programs backfired and left their intended beneficiaries worse off. Mr. Lemann, the former dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia, goes on to document that the percentage of Americans living in poverty declined substantially over the past half-century, according to one recent study, from 26% in 1967 to 16% in 2012. Today, as both political parties begin talking about issues of income inequality, the question of what really happened in the 60s, what kind of war we waged on poverty, and why there are so many poor families still living among us is of more than historical interest. It bears directly on our decision about whether and how to try again. Melissa Boteach of the Center for American Progress is an expert on these contemporary issues, and she served as the policy lead on the Shriver Report, an effort led by Mark's sister Maria to look at women and their families living in poverty and how best to address their plight. There's obviously much to discuss this evening, but one last theme to explore is the role President Kennedy played in inspiring the anti-poverty effort that was later championed by his successor. At the end of his presidency, with the economy steadily growing, JFK deemed the unemployment rate of 5.6% too high and felt that too many families continued to live in poverty. He launched a series of discussions with his cabinet on how the country might confront economic issues in his second term. His trip to Dallas marked the beginning of his bid for re-election, and the night before he died, in a speech in Houston, JFK talked of an America that is, quote, both powerful and peaceful, with a people that are both prosperous and just. We'll never know if his re-election bid would have succeeded. The 1964 campaign and the issues at the heart of it, social inequality, Vietnam, and civil rights, were bequeathed to his successor. Yet here in 2015, as the issue of inequality rises once again to the fore, the question of how we can be a people that are both prosperous and just is at the heart not only of tonight's conversation, but also of the type of nation we wish to become. To discuss these issues and more, please join me in welcoming to the Kennedy Library Melissa Boteach, Nicholas Lemann, Mark Shriver, Scott Stossel, and Julian Zelizer.
Well, thank you, Tom. And actually, it's funny because as I was preparing for the event tonight, I was looking back through some of my notes and reading the work of some of my co-panelists, and I was actually reading the transcript of that very recording that you just played, and I was thinking, boy, I wish I had the technological wherewithal that I could actually play that, because it actually captures the Johnson treatment in some vivid way and conveys a little bit of the, history is always an interplay between great impersonal forces and sort of underlying, at the time that the war on poverty was being implemented, bubbling up from below was the civil rights movement, and yet, there was something about the interplay between LBJ and your dad, Sargent Shriver, that was very, very meaningfully determining of how that war on poverty would turn out. You also stole my thunder a little bit by quoting a quote that I was going to begin with, which is, we go from, so we are now, I guess, 50 years from the launch of the actual implementation of the war on poverty, but about 51 years and a month from when LBJ got up on January 8th, 1964, and say the nation now hereby declares an unconditional war on poverty. And then you flash forward 20-some years from there, and you've got Ronald Reagan saying, America declared a war on poverty, and poverty won. And then a year ago, again on the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of that Johnson speech, you had the White House actually issuing a fairly long document demonstrating all the ways in which the war on poverty had reduced poverty, and you had the Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank, listing all the ways in which it actually had failed to. So the war on poverty remains very much a contested sort of set of policies and kind of cultural moment, and my co-panelists here are very well equipped to talk about it. So just with a very, I guess, quick note of background, and then I'll turn to some questions. Tom had alluded to the fact that actually the war on poverty was sort of nurtured and hatched during the Kennedy administration. Before he was killed in 1963, he had been meeting with some of his cabinet members talking about how we need to address this. There's a famous document, which I think is actually here in the library, where he was sitting at a meeting and he doodled, and he wrote multiple times, poverty, poverty, poverty. He'd been meeting with Walter Heller, who's head of the Bureau of the Budget. And the reason that he got interested in poverty, going back to his campaign in 1960, he went to West Virginia and saw in the hollers of West Virginia this sort of, acute poverty that was almost a world apart from the world that he inhabited, certainly, and that most of the rest of us inhabited. And then, but the kind of key turning point for him was, I think in 1962, Michael Harrington, who was kind of a left-wing journalist, wrote The Other America, where he traveled around and chronicled the life of the poor, who were mostly invisible to the majority of Americans. Although it came out, it actually didn't get that much attention. The way it got to President Kennedy's attention was that Dwight McDonald, writing for The New Yorker, where Nick is a staff writer, wrote what I think was then and may still be the longest ever review in The New Yorker's history. It was a 50-page review of The Other America. And multiple of President Kennedy's aides sort of handed it to him and said, look, you need to do something about this. So he was sort of gearing up to do this. Then you had the tragedy of Dallas, and Lyndon Johnson kind of seized on this as something that was very meaningful to him because he had grown up somewhat in poverty himself, had worked in the Works Progress administration under LBJ, and he said, I'm going to try to claim this. And this got sort of complicated because he wanted to claim it. It was sort of a Kennedy legacy. We can get into that later. But I guess the simple question is, how did we get from the point where there was this tremendous sense of hope and promise in 1964. We're going to end poverty. Both Sargent Shriver and Lyndon Johnson at various times had mapped out, we're going to end poverty, eliminate it by 1976. That didn't happen, and there's a lot of reasons why. I know Sargent Shriver would have said that was the case because he was deprived of funding within 2 or 3 years because Vietnam started taking money away. But how do you get to the point where Ronald Reagan can say we fought a war on poverty and poverty lost? And I guess I'll start on the far left with Nick, who's written a lot about this.
Well, let me mention 2 names that haven't been mentioned. This is a little, as they say in the Academy, orthogonal, and then I'll get back to your question. Name number 1 is Bobby Kennedy, who we should talk about because he's a really, really important figure, more important, I would argue, than John Kennedy in the origins of the war on poverty. So that's just a marker. The other that won't have occurred to you, but it just is a way to connect the dots, is Janet Yellen.
Yeah.
Jim Tobin worked for Walter Heller and helped formulate all that economic thinking. Janet Yellen was his protege and is now trying to sort of quietly enact some of those ideas around the war on poverty from the Fed chairman's chair. And it seems to be working, by the way. But that gets to my point. What President Kennedy did not do was declare war on poverty. My advice to anybody in the audience or on the panel who wants to become president is, if you're going to declare war on a traditional nation state, particularly one that's weaker than your country. It's really dangerous to declare war on a sort of condition because you're setting yourself up for the Reagan-style riposte. And, you know, that's the liberal version. The conservative version, of course, is George W. Bush. Famously, I was there in the press gallery when he did it, of the House of Representatives declaring war on terror. And it just as it's very hard to sort of identify and defeat poverty and get them to sit on the deck of the aircraft carrier signing the surrender agreement, ditto terror. So I personally think, I don't know if you all agree, that it was probably a mistake to declare war on poverty, even though it was a wonderful and inspiring dramatic gesture in real time, because it's so hard to deliver on the promise.
And I wonder if we should define some terms here, and I'm happy to do it myself or to turn it over to you guys, and then I'll turn to my right. I mean, there's actually sort of a fuzzy sense of what the war on poverty actually was, because it merges with some of the other aspects of the Great Society. I mean, the war on poverty, and again, my lens is through Sargent Shriver, was the programs that were governed through the OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity. Right. And this is where it's sort of ironic that people declare that it was defeat, because many of the things that in a very short period of time in 1964 and 1965 that Sargent Shriver and his colleagues got off the ground still exist and are very, very politically popular, if not universally so. Head Start, Job Corps, Vista, some of these other things. But so that was what was under OEO, along with Legal Services for the Poor, Neighborhood Health Services, Community Action, which we'll talk about later, which was one of the maybe sources of undoing politically of the war on poverty. But it also sort of bleeds out into larger Great Society things having to do with the Civil Rights Movement, which was unfolding. The Civil Rights Act was being legislated at exactly the same time. The legislation of, I believe, Medicare and Title I of the Education Act. What is the war on poverty is not necessarily a clearly defined thing. But you've both written about the cultural and political context in which this took place, and I wonder if you could maybe start with Julian. Talk about what made it possible for to have this sort of efflorescence of, this was maybe the high watermark, although I know you actually take issue with this a little bit, the high watermark of kind of post-war American liberalism, when a super ambitious set of programs to fight poverty and other issues was possible, but maybe there was overreaching, and talk a little bit about that.
One thing I hope we can come back to later is just the concept that it didn't work. Because I think there's an argument that Nick has talked about and others that it actually did work, and especially if you take a holistic view of the war on poverty, including other programs, it's not clear that it failed because the policies actually failed, as opposed to a kind of political argument that was made by the right. But in my mind, two things were hugely important beyond Johnson or Kennedy. The civil rights movement had an enormous impact on public opinion and on legislative opinion by 1964 that is absolutely central to understand what's shaking up Congress. Congress at this time is far from conservative. Far from liberal. It was dominated by a coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans called the Conservative Coalition that basically had created many headaches for Kennedy. It's one of the reasons his domestic initiatives didn't go forward, not because he didn't want to push them, but he had a horrible Congress. And the civil rights movement, we have to remember and kind of recapture what a huge seismic impact that had, including on issues of poverty. And Johnson saw those two issues as related. A second thing, and this is basic politics, the election of 1964. So the election of 64 creates huge Democratic majorities. After this, a lot of the other policies will pass. 295 Democrats in the House, 68 Democrats in the Senate, and the balance between the liberals and the Southerners shifts to the liberals. So there's a great playing field that the electorate made, in addition to the civil rights movement. And the final thing is the war on poverty, in terms of the OEO, was not funded very generously. The rhetoric was grand, but the money wasn't. And Johnson doesn't really push for huge levels of appropriations for this program, and many people have looked back at that as another mistake. It's unclear what his options really were, but I think that's a kind of, the first two are the positive context of the time, but the fact this was not a grandiose program in terms of money is important understanding why it could go through.
Let me add one other piece of context, and there's a number of others, so I'm trying to be brief. All the stuff about Appalachia was probably sincere, but in the minds of the founders, this was really about race relations. Yeah. And it was the moment when it was starting to dawn on people that even if you passed all the things that dismantled the legal Jim Crow system in the United States, there would still be an enormous race problem. And so what do you do then? What's your next move? It wasn't okay just to say, okay, we've dismantled Jim Crow, now we're done, we can walk away, race problem solved. And so that's where you get in. I mean, as contentious as civil rights was, the question of what to do next was way more contentious. And this is a lot of the daring and failures of the war on poverty was about how hard a question that is in terms of the actual issues, in terms of political consensus and backlash, et cetera.
I want to come back to that and talk about whether there were sort of the seeds of the, not necessarily the failure of the war on poverty, but its dissolution were built in. But Nick, you have a line in your book, as I recall, that's something like, between 1964, when landslide victory for Lyndon Johnson, destruction of Barry Goldwater. Obviously, between 1964 and 1966, politics changed dramatically. You have a line that says, 1965 was the year in which history sort of turned on a hinge, or something like that. And you have a couple of things. One is LBJ authorizes sending 100,000 troops to Vietnam. Big deal, especially in the ensuing years. We'll come back to that. Also, outbreak of riots, I believe, in Watts.
The real hinge, if you want drama, I don't remember exactly how many days it was, but it was less than 10 between signing the Voting Rights Act and the tremendous civil unrest in Watts, LA. And that was, to white people, a huge wake-up, I don't know if it would be a wake-up call or a mystification call. This feeling, sort of what I alluded to, what is going on here? Why isn't everything all hearts and flowers now that the Jim Crow is finally being dismantled? So that was, there was, how many days was it?
It's something, it's in August of 1965.
Yeah, they're both
something
in
like
August.
10 days. And then the second set of riots in Detroit and New York in 67 are even more devastating for the program, because by that time the conservatives have regained power in Congress. And one small example, there's this small bill for rat extermination in cities that Johnson sends to Congress in 67. It's a minor bill. No one thinks it's going to be controversial. Everyone says, who's going to be against this? The riots break out in Detroit. Conservatives say we're not going to pass the civil rats bill, and start to link the rioting to every program, including that. And the bill is actually killed, which is a surprise. So by the second set of riots 2 years later, you really see how these two are connected
And
politically.
two other quick things. 66, we all know about off-year elections. 66, an off-year election was the year that gave birth to the phrase white backlash, because there was a big Republican wave that year, particularly in sort of urban blue-collar white areas. And then legislatively, the wake-up call was the failure of fair housing for a long time, at least. That was where you started to find the limit of white goodwill, even in those times.
Well, I'll come back to, because the intersection of civil rights and backlash against civil rights, and under the context of OEO and war on poverty, particularly community action and what was known as maximum feasible participation, was the hugely controversial thing. But let's come back to that. I want to turn to my right now and talk about how both Mark and Melissa, you're now on the cutting edge of actually trying to continue to fight poverty today. Do you think the war on poverty was a failure, and how does the legacy of what Sargent Shriver, Lyndon Johnson, and President Kennedy before them did affect how you think at the Center for American Progress and in your own work about the work of poverty reduction.
Thanks. I actually would agree with Nick's analysis that waging war on poverty was probably not the right metaphor. I mean, coming off of World War II, there was sort of this clear moral case for war, but in today's context, I don't think war is the correct metaphor because, you know, you have to continue to fight poverty every day. It's not something that you declare war and then it disappears. A lot has changed in the past 50 years, and so I think one of the points we've been trying to make on the 50th anniversary of all these programs is that the poverty rate would be twice as high without this. If we hadn't expanded Social Security benefits, if we hadn't created a permanent food stamp program that kept 5 million people out of poverty last year, if we hadn't expanded the earned income tax credit and established early education programs, all these different things meant that the poverty rate is now about half what it would be. And the statistic we keep saying that the poverty rate fell from 26% in 1967 to 16% in 2012, nearly all of that is from government transfers. It's not because the economy is actually working for people. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's acknowledge the successes that we've had, but let's also acknowledge that we haven't really done enough to update our policies in the past 50 years. Since the end of the war on poverty, the share of income going to the top 1% of earners has doubled. Women have gone from being breadwinners or co-breadwinners in 25% of families, or about a quarter of families, to around 2/3 of families. Demographically, we've had major shifts in racial and ethnic composition. And you know, back in the 1960s, the high school graduation that was the birthright of every American was what you needed to get a good job. And today you need at least some college to get a good job. So our economy, our workplace, they're all fundamentally different. And in many ways, our policies haven't caught up. And so a lot of what we're trying to do today is to both defend the progress that we've made. The war on poverty didn't fail. We'd have twice that rate without it. But also to show how we need to tackle income inequality. We need to update our workplace policies so that families can balance breadwinning and caregiving. We need to make sure that Americans can access post-secondary education. And we need to address the persistent racial and ethnic disparities that are not only a moral abomination, but also are going to undercut our economic edge moving forward, because by 2042, we're going to be a majority-minority country. And this is a reality that our public policies have yet to grapple with. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is, yes, defense, but also let's update our policies, because this isn't a war that you declare and then you win and that's it. This is an ongoing fight, and that's part of what we're trying to communicate to folks.
Do you think it, for all of you, do you think it's a winnable fight? I mean, the Bible says, "The poor you shall always have with you."
It also says, "There shall be no needy among you."
Yeah.
But I do, and you know, it inspires me that you know, there's fast food workers striking across the country today. There's home care workers organizing for fair wages. I think sometimes we have this nostalgia for the 1960s as this was the era of activism. But I work with activists and talk to activists every day who are organizing in their communities for a fair minimum wage, for paid sick days, for rezoning laws that are going to enable low-income entrepreneurs to get their businesses off the ground. There is enormous amounts of exciting social activism going on today, and I don't think that we need to be just nostalgic about the past. I think we need to be focusing like a laser beam on the amazing state and local work that is building momentum for national change, even as this Congress has struggled to get things done.
Well, Mark, you're in the unique on this panel position of being both on the front lines of doing public service now and working with kids, and also you were obviously an infant during most of the launching of the war on poverty. You'd probably, but I'm
Anybody Harold there.
but I'm curious about two things. What would your dad say to you over the years, especially as you got older and got into public service yourself? About, I mean, did he think? And I have my own thoughts on this, but what's your view about whether he thought the war on poverty had been a success? What would he have done differently? And what's your view, again, from sitting on front lines? And Mark has written a fantastic book about his dad, which I recommend to everybody.
I think the first thing you'd ask is, why are you on this panel? Because, I mean, I'm fascinated listening to all four of you. It's really an amazing panel. And when I was asked to join here, I'm like, you've got some of the best thinkers, if not the best thinkers in the country. What do you want me on there for? But I'm here. I think the issue we haven't clarified, we use the term the Office of Economic Opportunity, the War on Poverty, the Great Society, all get interchanged. So I hope that one of the four of you can really clarify that for me. I mean, I have some thoughts on it, but I don't, in the last year and a half, they get interchanged, right? And the things you just talked about, Melissa, are really, those are income transfer programs, and the things I think Dad ran in the Office of Economic Opportunity, whereas he said constantly, not a hand out, but a hand up.
Right.
So Head Start is supposed to train little kids to enter kindergarten ready to learn. Legal Services is supposed to provide legal services to poor people. These are not income transfer programs, right? So I think we've kind of put them all together, and I think we need to pull them apart a little bit.
Yeah.
I think, though, that he would say exactly, I think, having heard what Melissa just said, it kind of fired me up. Yeah. I think if he thought that we were still handling issues from 1965 in the same way that they were trying to figure them out in 1965, he'd think we were a bunch of, knuckleheads. Because he was constantly trying and talking about innovation, trying things differently, being big and bold, yes, but trying to be different and to constantly improve it. So the issues that in the economic structure, the class structures that were around in 65 are totally different than they are today. And I think you said them beautifully. So I think we need to be creative about it. And I think he never thought we declared war on poverty and it was won. Because I think he always saw it as an ongoing struggle. And I think that's important. But I think it would be helpful, maybe the two of you guys can tell us, what is the difference on the war on poverty, the Office of Economic Opportunity, and the income transfer thing, because that was a little, whoa.
No, and I would just, I want to ask actually both you guys to kind of tease out the differences between Great Society, war on poverty per se, and other elements of the kind of Johnson agenda. But you're absolutely right that there was a moment, and I think he talked, but it was Johnson talking to one of his aides saying, and you all heard that audio of Johnson imploring Shriver, or more than imploring, telling him, you're going to be doing this. But then he would send his aides and said, you tell Shriver no doles. This is all about, as you say, a hand up, not a hand out.
Well, the office is called the Office of Economic Opportunity.
Right. This was not redistributive, and part of the Great Society actually was redistributive. But the war on poverty under the OEO was very explicitly and consciously not that. And again, I keep previewing that we'll get to kind of community action and maximum feasible participation. But what are the distinctions? Where does the war on poverty end and Great Society begin, and how do they all fit together?
Let's do a little mini primer here. Great Society is a good term for the works of Lyndon Johnson as president. It has a number of building blocks, all of which Julian goes through very well in his book. In money terms, by far the biggest is Medicare. Yeah. And then there's Medicaid, which is a poverty program, but is not part of the war on poverty is this big piece of rhetoric that mapped onto a very small program with 10 little mini titles called the Office of Economic Opportunity, which Sargent Shriver headed. I'll use this as a chance to pay tribute to another person, another anniversary. Did anybody here know Henry Hampton? Great documentary filmmaker who made Eyes on the Prize. So after he made Eyes on the Prize and Eyes on the Prize 2, he made a wonderful multi-part documentary, which I worked on a lot too, called America's Struggle Against Poverty. And I think that's a very nice term, and all should buy it and watch it, because it encompasses these things that weren't strictly part of the OEO. And then this gets back to some of the ironies you were noting. The air date for that was exactly 20 years ago. Exactly 20 years and a month ago. It was January 1995. It was supposed to be, pushing Bill Clinton to really get on the case with this. And turned out that was the maximum power moment of Newt Gingrich, who himself, a la Reagan, loved to go around declaring the war on poverty a failure and say that he was reversing, as you pointed out, Mark, there's a great irony there, because Newt would say, opportunity is exactly the opposite of the spirit of the war on poverty, when in fact it was exactly the name and spirit of the war on poverty. So this wonderful film came out, and nobody paid attention to it. It got terrible ratings. Henry was very depressed. And then he tragically died at the age of 53, so that was his last sort of huge work. But it's a wonderful piece of film that rightly understands struggle against poverty rather than war on poverty as a sort of way to answer the question you're asking, and that also definitely understands it as the sort of follow-on to the civil rights movement and its victories.
I mean, look, you have the War on Poverty is a very specific program with the OEO, and I think usually that's what people now talk about. But you know, what was remarkable about this period was Johnson and other liberals in Congress saw this issue more holistically.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the confusion is a confusion created by this approach. And some would argue it was a smarter approach. So Medicare is dealing with a problem of poverty that afflicted the elderly at that time through health insurance. And so using Social Security taxes to pay for hospital insurance was part of the war on poverty. When Johnson meets with civil rights leaders in January of 1964, and they come to get his support for the Civil Rights Bill, he says, I need your support on poverty, and kind of argues all of this is related. He says the same with his education programs.
Title I is
Title I, it's not
targeted anti-poverty
it's
program.
one of the biggest
right,
anti-poverty
and
programs.
he made the argument connected to the making people self-sufficient, that without strong education opportunities, whether Head Start or funding for elementary and secondary programs more broadly, you can't eradicate. Even when he was dealing with housing in the most controversial of the civil rights bills, he sees that as connected. So when the riots break out in Watts and Detroit, on the one hand, Johnson could be terrible and kind of use the worst language to talk about the rioters. And then he could turn around in the same conversation and say, if we don't deal with issues like housing, if we don't deal with what he said were 40% unemployment rates, and we don't deal with these structural problems, we're never going to kind of end the anger that exists. So I think it was just a holistic approach that included income transfers, it included community action programs, and it was kind of a smorgasbord to touch everything that was going on in the period. And that's why the study at Columbia, which you're referring to, said you have to look at it that way to really evaluate whether this worked. Because if you put all the programs together that dealt with poverty out of this, it looks like a pretty successful program in many ways, and it's really made a big dent.
The other thing I would just add that we haven't really spoken about is the labor market during this time. And how fundamentally different it is from the labor market today. I think if you ask most people what the best ticket out of poverty is, they'd say good job. Right. And at the time, a perfect complement to this, whether you call it the war on poverty or the Great Society or whatever it is, the combination of both opportunity and transfer programs was a hot economy in which the gains from economic growth were broadly shared and distributed. And in fact, people at the lower and middle end were sometimes getting higher shares of the gains from economic growth than those at the top. Between 1964 and 1973, that strong economy complemented by this suite of programs and a historically high minimum wage cut poverty by over 40%. Fast forward to today, and you have historic levels of income inequality akin to right before the Great Depression. And so you see that it has been 5 straight years of economic growth since the Great Recession ended, and the vast majority, over 90% of it, has gone to the top 1%, which means flat or declining wages for those in the middle and the bottom. And so I think we're having this conversation about sort of the historical legacy and the safety net programs, which are key complements, but the reason our safety net is having to work overtime today is because we've had an explosion of low-wage work and an explosion of income inequality, which is really threatening to increase poverty despite the best efforts of these programs.
But it's not just that. I mean, connected to the economy, this was a union-based economy. Yep. 30% of the workforce was unionized. The AFL-CIO was a huge presence. You asked kind of what created the context. When I talk about the civil rights movement, labor is in my mind as part of that coalition. And they were a huge driving force. Even on the war on poverty legislation, they helped round up votes in states like Pennsylvania. And so it's not only the jobs have changed and the jobs are worse, but we've lost really what was fundamental to the heart of liberalism, I think, in the mid-1960s. And without that same union presence, it's very hard to kind of rebuild that kind of support.
So are you all saying then that 20 years after it happens, going back to your question, Scott, of President Reagan and Newt Gingrich a few years later saying it was a disaster or it lost, is because they pick out certain components of it, or they just use broad rhetoric, or the whole package was so broad that you can pick out one or two, or are they just saying it without, it's just political rhetoric?
The words war on poverty puts you in a political danger zone from the minute they leave your mouth. So that's most of it. Reagan actually started his career running against the war on poverty. One of his early, when he was governor of California, causes that brought him to national attention was fighting against the Legal Services Corporation, which was one of the 10 titles of the OEO. So he knew exactly what the war on poverty really was, but the rhetorical flight left an opening to make a very imprecise but effective rhetorical response. Touching on a point Julian made too, and this gets a little into the weeds, but it's important. It gets us to the community action program and maximum feasible participation. Johnson was a man who was deeply embedded in the sort of pluralist political system that he had grown up in, where, if you wanted to do something in politics, you do business with politicians, you do business with labor leaders, you do business with interest groups, et cetera. And the incredible political vulnerability of community action was that it was founded on the principle of you're going to cut all those people out of the action, keep them out, let the community control these programs, which is deeply appealing idea, especially at the time, but it means you don't have any cover because, and some of this is in Julian's book, all the governors hate you, all the union leaders hate you, all the mayors hate you, and there you are, so you're really like sitting out there on the prairie, wrapped in a blanket against the howling winds. And so it's that conception of politics sort of without politicians, without interest groups, that makes you very vulnerable.
You mean a politics with the people, you mean? I mean, is that what it, is it maximum feasible participation
I'm more
about
friendly to the interest groups, so I would say, or I have become over the years, it's very appealing to say, let's take politics to the grassroots and let the people determine politics.
Right.
But you could also say, the people are the people who elected President Kennedy president, et cetera. That is, the idea that electoral politics and the people are totally divorced is supportable in the early 60s about African Americans in the South because they didn't have the right to vote. But I don't think it's supportable about, let's say the Kennedy family in Boston, that they're politicians, so they have no connection to the people and what they want, right? It's a complicated relationship, but you enter a zone of great vulnerability when you say we're going to practice politics and government without politicians.
And let's.
I like politicians.
Let me. I'll start by stipulating that we don't necessarily we don't accept the Heritage Foundation Reagan conclusions about war on poverty, and yet. There's a degree to which, Sargent Shriver from after 1964, when he had great success getting it legislated originally, again, it was relatively small, $1 billion in the scheme of the federal budget. But then, you get to 66, 67, he's fighting a war where it's getting smaller and smaller. My question is, are the seeds of what was the greater source of damage to the war on poverty and particularly to the OEO? Was it the fight between guns and butter, and that by 1965, as I mentioned earlier, Johnson's already sending 100,000 troops to Vietnam. In 66 and 67, literally the dollars, the dollars are limited, and dollars that Sargent Shriver and other members of the Great Society were hoping would be earmarked for social programs are now getting sent overseas. Is it that, or now getting to the idea of community action. So community action, which was from the very early on, this came out of Bobby Kennedy's research, working under President Kennedy, into how do you actually affect change? How do you empower the poor? And it was involve them, give money directly to them, go around the local political establishments, including the mayor, which is a admirable idea, and yet ended up causing all kinds of headaches. And maximum feasible participation refers to this idea that when you're comprising sort of the boards of these community action committees, they should have as many members of the poor as opposed to members of the local political establishment. This, over a period of a couple of years, ended up being a complete political disaster because, as you were saying, you've got the mayors and the governors coming to LBJ and saying, "What's going on? You're giving all this money to these radical black activists who are just fighting against me." Shriver and his colleagues are trying to combat that, and so you've got the civil rights activists saying, "You're cutting us off at the knees." Which was the greater cause of the kind of undoing?
Look, look, there are problems internal to the program, whether it's the grandiose rhetoric matched with what was a small budget. Only half of that was for the new programs, combined with trying to circumvent someone like Mayor Daley in Chicago, which is the classic example of how you needed the politician or you left Shriver out without that kind of support. Part of it was external to the program, and the guns versus butter, this is the debate in 67 and 68, where Johnson wants a tax hike surcharge to pay for Vietnam, and basically he's forced to concede budget cuts so that the conservatives, who regain their strength in the midterms, will let this through. And that was huge. That was a big factor. And no matter how well the program was doing, it was going to face cuts, I think, in the environment that existed in 67 and 68, both because of what's going on in Capitol Hill, but also because of the trade-offs spending on Vietnam then required. And finally, I would say, I think the program, whatever it was doing, it was going to be attacked by the right in the 1970s and 80s. It's not necessarily a rational argument about whether the policy works or not. This became symbolic for the right. It became symbolic, and you can argue why, there's different reasons, but it became a focus of attack. I don't really think it mattered if it was working or not. This became the icon of liberalism.
Sounds like the healthcare law.
No, actually, I have a trivia question for you all, and no one on the panel is allowed to answer. Do you know who succeeded Sargent Shriver as head of the OEO under Nixon?
I do.
Donald Rumsfeld.
And with Dick Cheney as his deputy.
And that's one of the few. Nixon doesn't cut most of the Great Society. In fact, he expands a lot of it. Yep. But that's one program he goes after by putting Rumsfeld in charge to kind of secretly start gutting this program that he was leading. And so you could see already symbolically, because it's for the weakest America, it's not a big surprise. It's the most vulnerable Americans who benefit. You're not going to go after Medicare, but this is more attractive politically in many ways.
But we also, almost under Nixon, had a huge expansion of child care, which was vetoed. And again, this gets at, towards the end of, the official war on poverty up until today, one of the themes of the Shriver Report is that one of the huge things that's changed is women's workforce participation and the extent to which they're trying to balance caregiving and breadwinning. And the fact that we're the only country in the world, pretty much with few exceptions, who doesn't have any form of paid family leave, the only one who doesn't have any form of paid sick days, so parents are making these impossible choices between losing a day's income or even their job and caring for their kid who has the flu. We don't have any we have this patchwork childcare thing that only serves 1 in every 6 eligible families, and we don't have equal pay. So if we were to actually have if women working full-time made the same as men working full-time, we'd cut the poverty rate for working women and their families in half. That was one of the numbers that came out of our Shriver Report. So there's things, I think, politically that happened, but I think failure to adapt is not necessarily something happened and then this happened. It's sort of this ongoing way in which the successes have not been able to keep up with today's realities, and one place where we need a progressive vision going forward, not just nostalgia looking backwards.
I want to actually bring this down to the personal, because obviously, in my research on the founding of the War on Poverty, so much of what sort of emanated from it was the product of your dad's kind of fervid idealism and sometimes craziness and all of that. But there was, this was all, and he sort of entered into this somewhat reluctantly. He didn't want to do it. We heard that video, that audio tape. He was running the Peace Corps at the same time. I mean, this was insane. For 2 years, he was running the Peace Corps and the War on Poverty, and he would tell Johnson, I can't handle this. And he goes, oh, look, Bob McNamara is running a much bigger budget than you are combined. Get over yourself. But there were, and I know Julian might take issue with this and has taken issue with his book, but there was a sense in which the mid-1960s, before the riots and the sort of agonies of Vietnam, there was kind of a high water mark of post-war liberalism, which your dad had lived through. But there were two things on the positive side and on the negative side that were kind of very germane to everything that he did in setting up the War on Poverty and running it. And one was this kind of ethic of service, which I know he managed to inculcate, which was much more sort of prevalent in the ethos of the time, from the moment that President Kennedy succeeded President Eisenhower, but that continued, particularly after the assassination. And Johnson, very effectively kind of in his first speech, in his inaugural address, President Kennedy had said, "Let us begin," and LBJ said, "Let us continue." He very much wanted to, carry the Kennedy mantle, but it was somewhat vexed for him because he had this complicated relationship with the Kennedy family. He particularly had a complicated relationship with Bobby Kennedy, who he always feared was gunning for him, was going to try to, maybe run against him in 1968. And your dad was, of course, stuck in the middle, being a member of the Kennedy family by marriage, but being a loyal employee of LBJ. So the two things, and these are very different. To what extent did your dad's being caught between, Bobby Kennedy, who in many ways shared all of the same impulses about trying to alleviate poverty, and he was the father in some ways of community action. And yet, Lyndon Johnson is always looking at him skeptically, and both, on the one hand, using your dad as a cudgel to kind of abuse Bobby, but at the same time, afraid that your dad is actually a representative of the Kennedy family who's out to undermine him. So I'm just curious whether that has sort of become part of family lore. And then, completely separate thing, obviously your dad is in my experience, is as devout a Catholic and a religious person as I've ever met. And this powerfully infused his sense of commitment and service. And I wonder just your thoughts on how that inflected his approach to public policy and public service in general.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for calling him crazy. I'm sure he would appreciate it. I guess the answer to the first question is no, there's no, my father never complained about being caught in the middle of, whatever was going on between the Attorney General, Senator Kennedy, and, him and President Johnson. There's nothing I'm going to say on that because he never said anything on it. He has a consistent outlook on life, was positive. He lost elections. He got crushed in elections. It was always about, okay, what do we do today or tomorrow? It was never about looking back. He was a devout Catholic. There's no question about it. He went to Mass every day. And I think that infused his work and the way he, treated people. So he treated, you as the moderator the same as he treated anybody in here, that you were all equally important in his eyes. And that sounds goofy, and it's hard to believe, but it's true. And that's the way he operated, because he believed that God was in everybody and in every interaction. And if you believe that, then you have to treat you the same as you treat anyone else, whether you're the moderator of a panel or whether you're the Cardinal of Boston or, senator or the janitor. He treat the people that are going to clean up this room when we all leave here in 20 minutes or half an hour, whenever we leave, the same as he would treat best-selling authors. So I think that permeated him. It permeated his work. I'm more interested in the question about the high point of liberalism. I think that, my perspective on it is that politics is a contact sport. And, he had a lot of fights. This concept of we pivoted from the Southern conservatives in '63 to, you guys described a kind of a window of a year and a half or 2 years, and then it's over. You look at what FDR went through, he got smashed around.
Right.
Kennedy gets smashed around. It's a contact sport. Jefferson got smashed around, right? So I think, this idea that the Kennedys were in this kind of, wonderful moment in time and everything was progressive and idyllic is not the way, my father talked about it.
Or your uncle. I mean, he was stymied at every turn by, ironically, I mean, and this is one of the things that's amazing to me, reading your book. Here we are, politics, gridlock is a fact of life, and it's highly partisan. And yet, at the time, the Republicans really were then, in a more meaningful sense, the party of Lincoln, and it was the Southern Democrats who were the obstructionists for both Kennedy and LBJ in opposing civil rights legislation.
They were. I mean, Republicans clearly Dirksen, Senator Everett Dirksen, who's the Senate Minority Leader, is key for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. The Wizard of Oz was the name people called him for his long-winded speeches. Although, by '67, he turns against the administration on a lot of issues. Once the kind of political moment changes, he is not supportive of open housing bill. He is one of the leaders going against Johnson on the guns versus butter debate. Many Republicans give the war on poverty, most actually, give it a big no during much of the debate. They don't want it. Jerry Ford is one of the Republicans that drives Johnson crazy. He's like, who could be against the war on poverty? Ford can. And he's kind of surprised. So it's true. And you have, in the end, Republican support. But there was also a lot of conservative Republican, not Goldwater conservatism, but still pretty conservative politics. Medicare is another area. Republicans end up in 1965 putting forth two versions of Medicare on their own to compete with the administration. They go from no to yes because Goldwater had been killed because of his opposition to Medicare. And Wilbur Mills, who before his famous scandal, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, takes the administration bill, the two Republican bills, puts it all together in what's called a three-layer cake. And that's how you get Medicare Part A and Part B and Medicaid. But what's interesting there is the Republicans really become aggressive in being cooperative because they all saw Goldwater just kind of tank with the anti-Social Security, anti-Medicare message. So even there, I would check a little of kind of the vision of Republican cooperation.
I want to turn to Melissa in a second, but I remember when Robert Caro's latest installment of his multi-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson came out, The Passage of Power, and there was a lot of chatter among Democrats in Congress, and I think even White House aides saying, oh, we've got to get this to Obama so he can see how Lyndon Johnson, worked Congress. And it's true that Lyndon Johnson was famous when he was majority leader for giving the Johnson treatment and for being, brilliant at cutting deals. After 1964, from 1964 to 1966, and even after, Lyndon Johnson had a huge Democratic majority that Barack Obama simply does not have. And so to some degree, these things are not applicable. And that sort of sets up my question for you, which is, I know you're very focused on, how do we continue, poverty is still endemic in the United States, too high. We've had a bad economy for the last 6 years. The middle class is struggling, even though the poverty rate may have come down a little bit. If we were to, and we shouldn't, we all agree to launch another war on poverty, but what are the sets of policies that should be implemented now to try to cut down on the poverty rate in the United States?
It's a great question. So I think there's a couple things that we can do. And we did a poll actually in the 50th anniversary on the war on poverty. And what's interesting is that the suite of policies I'm about to outline, while they may seem very contentious in the Congress, when you actually poll Americans on them, they're quite bipartisan, and there are strong bipartisan majorities that support them. So everything from raising the minimum wage, which could lift up to 4.6 million people out of poverty, policies to update our basic labor standards to enable people to balance their breadwinning and caregiving responsibilities, which is one of the reasons behind the gender pay gap. And as I mentioned before, if we were to close the gender pay gap, we cut poverty in half for working women and their families. That's a huge deal. We would expand the earned income tax credit to include workers without children, and make the Recovery Act provisions like for the earned income tax credit and child tax credit permanent. Early childhood education, which is something I'm sure Mark could talk even more about. He's a huge national leader on this, but expanding childcare, pre-K, it's not just good for today in terms of working parents able to have a safe and stable place for their kids. It's economic mobility, because when you invest in kids from birth to 5, it has huge long-term effects on their earnings, on their education, on their employment, in ways that it's the next generation of fighting poverty. The basis of Half and 10, which is a campaign that we run out of Center for American Progress, is that if you were to raise the minimum wage to its historic levels, make the tax code work better for low-wage working families, and expand early education and childcare, you could cut poverty get more than halfway to the Half and 10 goal over 10 years. One of the things I think that's important to note is that as you're improving labor standards, you're actually ultimately saving money in the safety net. We commissioned a study showing that if you raise the minimum wage to $10.10, which is, by the way, less than what it was in inflation-adjusted dollars in 1968, you would save $46 billion in food stamps over the next 10 years. So I think there's a broad political support for this agenda, and we're in the process now of building momentum at the state level, at the local level, and putting pressure on members of Congress to enact these kinds of reforms.
One final question, then I think we'll open it up to the audience, but I wanted to ask Mark, and actually I wanted to confirm something that you said earlier, that, having spent a lot of time, interviewing your dad, it's completely true. It was always, it took me a while to realize this, but, I would go to an event with him and we'd be talking to the heads of state of a bunch of African countries, and he would be asking, he was so genuinely curious and asking them all these questions, and then we'd be meeting with senators and he'd be asking them all these questions, and then I was with him in Penn Station and he's talking to the literally the shoe shine boy, right. And he is asking, and it's not even like, it's not faux, like he had that same sincere, deep curiosity. He's asking them with the same avid desire to know what he thinks about different things as he was, the leader of Senegal or the senator from Pennsylvania. So that's completely true. But I'm curious to what degree, in your work today with Save the Children, it's informed by what you've learned from your dad, either general or in particular from, obviously both your parents were involved in not only Special Olympics, but Head Start, I'm thinking about. Right. How does that inform how you think about?
Well, Melissa's being nice because there's a number of folks working on the early ed issue. I think it's the great social justice issue of our time. I think the fact that so many kids in America come into kindergarten so far behind where my kids are in kindergarten and are really honestly never going to catch up. There might be, the exception, but the exception for me proves the rule that is the big social justice issue. That kids are so far behind, kids in poverty are so far behind by the age of 4, 18 months developmentally behind my kids, that they're just not going to be able to compete. And if you look around the world, China has a huge national policy around early childhood education. Other countries are investing in early ed, and we're going to get our clocks cleaned. And when you go out of Washington, D.C., where that issue is associated with President Obama, and you go into states from the deep south all the way to the far west, a lot of these state governors, including Republicans, are investing in early ed. Not as much as I think they should, but it's got broad bipartisan support. It just can't get done in Washington. But the bottom line is, you can argue about Head Start programs, and Save the Children now runs a few Head Start programs around the country that were not well run by the groups that were doing them beforehand. They were poorly run. So not all Head Start programs are, highly efficient and effective. Most of them are. But you can focus on the ones that aren't doing well and throw the baby out with the bathwater, or you can say, you know what, we got to improve what we're doing. President Obama is trying to improve Head Start programs. He's putting them out to competitive bids. He's asking groups like Save the Children to take over programs and run them well. But that doesn't mean that if there are a few of them out there that aren't doing well, that you ought to say, look, we're not going to invest in early ed. And the real irony about it is that you look around at some of these, delegates in the state legislature, state senators, people on Capitol Hill that don't believe in early ed or say they don't, and then you go look at what they're doing with their kids, and they're paying out the nose to put their kids in the best high-quality pre-K programs, because they know that when their 4-year-old or 5-year-old enters kindergarten, pre-K, they got to be prepared. And they're not. Poor kids aren't. They're getting screwed. and it's outrageous what we're doing on that. So I don't know. If we're actually videotaping this, you can bleep out "screwed," right? You can do that, right, Tom?
Just to add one word about all this policy stuff, it's not that contentious. We're in the early stages of yet another election cycle, so I want to make a prediction, which is you'll hear a lot about these programs, and I'll tell you the label that will be put on them. Programs for the middle class. The way to get poverty programs passed is to call them programs for the middle class. And then people hear the substance and say, oh, I'm for that, as long as it's for the middle class. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing or a Faustian bargain? I don't know. But we've learned in 50 years, middle class is the magic phrase in American politics. Poverty is not.
I think that's true, but I think a lot of these, a lot of the poverty programs, though, that they want to devolve down to the states.
Yeah.
And my father, was always saying that he was weaned on states' rights. Governor Ritchie was a Shriver family friend, and Ritchie almost became the Democratic nominee in 24, and he was states' rights, local control. And I said to him, you weaned on that, and you're kind of the guy who's big government. And he said, well, sometimes big government, the federal government, not big government, federal government has to come in and step into a situation where it is totally unjust and create either the means of opportunity or not. I do think that there are a group of folks, even when you talk about middle class, that still want it to devolve down to the state and locals. And then when they want it at the state and locals, they don't really want it at the state and locals.
And can I just also take this to just sort of bringing it back around to the beginning of the discussion, to pierce one myth, which is I think that when we talk about the poor, people think about this stagnant class of folks that just, is struggling and, this is the same group of people. If you look at sort of long-term data, not just a point in time, 4 in 5 Americans is going to experience a year of really tough economic insecurity during their working years. From 2009 to 2011, in the wake of the Great Recession, 1 in 3 Americans experienced at least a 2-month spell of poverty. Only 3.5% of Americans were poor for all 3 years. The poor are us. Poverty in America is mainstream. And so these sort of the bright lines that people think divide the poor from the middle class are in fact an illusion. And so to the extent to which social movements recognize that and can break those down and not talk just in these class terms, I think you're going to get a broader base of support for a lot of these programs.
Right? Most of them are moving too.
Right.
There's a big article today about their...
Your dad was highly attuned to states' rights, and there was a brilliant, I think you both write about this, in trying to get some part of the War on Poverty, the OEO legislated. There was a moment where there was great resistance among Southern politicians that, this is a federal encroachment on states' rights. And he actually had a conversation with, I think it was Herman Talmadge from Georgia, senator, who basically said, look, here's what you do. Just give them veto authority. That will allow them to feel like they are managing to retain their states' rights. But the reality is when you're giving federal money to their district and you're helping not just African Americans but the whites who are their constituents, they're not going to say no. This was actually a very brilliant tactical maneuver on that in that regard. Why don't we open up to questions and then we'll take them until they tell us to stop.
Is this on?
Yes.
I have, excuse me. I have 2 points I wanted to make. The first one is a question I've been asking everybody I've come in contact with of a political nature for the past 5 years, and I've yet to get an answer for it. The question is, with our society becoming more and more automated, in other words, more and more productive, less and less jobs will become available. That's a good thing because we're doing more with less. But it's also a bad thing. What are we going to do when unemployment becomes possibly 6% normal? How are we going to handle that permanent level of unemployment as our country continues to get richer and richer? The second question I have is to hear a discussion from you about my reading from Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, where he suggests and recommends that the most effective rule that could be applied toward reducing the inequality gap is to tax wealth. On a global basis, a very small tax will do more than any other tax adjustment that could be dreamed of, including a tax on inheritance. And I'd like your ideas on that.
Thank you. Melissa, I know this is what you think about all the time. So.
Oh, goodness. I mean, I think to the first question, there's sort of two things that need to happen. One is that there are sectors that are continuing to grow that can't be outsourced. So for example, as the population ages over the next several years and the baby boomers go into their high disability and retirement years, there's a whole growth and explosion in care work that's going on. So there are jobs that are going to be growing. So part of what we're focused on is making sure those are good quality jobs, that there are career ladders, that right now if you are a home health aide or a home care worker, chances are you're living in poverty. And so we're focused on some of the jobs that aren't going to be outsourced and how to improve the quality of those jobs. The second, part of that is, a lot of the jobs that are going to be automated are not in the knowledge-based economy. So how do we make sure that we get people the education that they need in order to create the next wave of innovation and the next round of employment? And so that is involving higher education policy, making sure that people of all classes can access post-secondary education to innovate and create the next wave of jobs. So that's sort of the short answer. I'm happy to talk to you more offline about it afterwards. To the second point, I think yes. I think income and wealth inequality are bad because they flatline wages, and there's all kinds of issues, economic mobility that are associated with it. But taxing wealth is one way to generate the revenue that's needed to address some of those social problems. And it's an interesting book and an interesting and important idea.
Anyone else have anything to say on Piketty? Or?
I mean, just in general, though. I don't mean to be the pessimist. Taxing wealth in the United States is going to be a pretty hard sell with this Congress. And, the House Republicans have increased their numbers steadily. And right now, I think, liberal ideas face a long haul, even with bipartisan support on a lot of this. That doesn't really, there's bipartisan support for gun control, or there's bipartisan support for funding Homeland Security. But you have a really tough situation on Capitol Hill right now. And I don't know how that changes in the short term. Unless you reverse this growth. So I think in the abstract, it's a good idea. And ultimately, that's how you dampen inequality. That's how you raise funds for other programs. But at least in the U.S., not a global tax, but President Obama could only end some of the Bush tax cuts. But most of them survived. And I think that's just going to be a hard sell here in the States.
My question is very similar to the first gentleman. But I'd like to amplify on it a little bit. I think it was you, Melissa, who mentioned that there were large swaths of low-income jobs being created, and that a lot of the solutions that I've heard from the panel deal with income transfers, wage and benefit improvements, and that type of thing. The technology revolution is really eliminating huge categories of jobs everywhere. It was one thing when, at the dawn of the computer age, a lot of jobs were being technology jobs were being created. But the new jobs are very narrow in quantity. There are only so many opportunities for internet programmers or robotic technicians. Right. So I just wonder, where does job creation fit in dealing with poverty, and what kind of programs or momentum can be directed through legislation to create jobs that are more applicable to the general population? For instance, one of the categories mentioned was healthcare work. Yep. But healthcare workers, you're probably going to see a migration towards post-secondary training and postgraduate training in healthcare, just because people can't get work in other fields. So at some point, probably soon, healthcare is going to see a glut of nurses and physical therapists and other radiology technicians and so forth. So I guess my question, what's left from the other gentleman and myself, is what can be done to drive common blue collar, maybe blue collar type of work into the system. Perhaps construction projects,
Yes.
infrastructure projects,
So,
and
so what can create?
Yeah, well, you started an answer to the question, which is, we have nearly $1 trillion infrastructure gap in this country, and that is a great place to start investing that creates good jobs, but that also is improving our productive capacity to move goods to market and improving quality of life across the board. So infrastructure investments is one area where there's a place we could invest to create jobs. So that is one example. I think generally speaking, there needs to be a both-and strategy. We need to raise the floor in terms of improving the quality of low-wage jobs, everything from wages to basic labor standards like paid sick days and overtime. But we also need to have career ladders and post-secondary options to get people into medium and high-skill jobs in the future, because a lot of those jobs, as you said, are heading in that direction. So I think it's a both-and strategy, and I think that we need to make investments in things like infrastructure that we know generate jobs.
And how much harder is that in the era of where the labor movement has become as anemic as it's been in centuries?
It's much harder. It's much harder. I mean, I think Julian made a really important point when he said that labor was one of the core ingredients to both the political and public will building, but also the collective bargaining that allowed wages to be higher during that era. And so that's a very important point.
There's three historically ways in which the government can help, and this is, again, ideally, not practically, just given the politics. One is infrastructure, public works kind of jobs. Two is something that the community college proposal actually brings up, retraining people, educating people, making people more flexible and dynamic in an economy that requires that. And finally, the other thing the government has done since the start of this country is kind of large-scale investment in new areas of industry that then become the heart of our economy. And every kind of chapter in American economic history, you can almost always find some kind of sizable government investment behind launching it, including computers, because the government has the ability to take those risks and put in that kind of money. And so I think that's a third area where you'll see debate. Whether any of that happens, I don't know, but those are kind of historically the three things government can do.
Final two questions here first. And
Let's do them both at the same time because we have a panelist that we need to get to the airport.
okay. So
Technically, I'm at 9, but that's okay.
very quickly, 10-second question each.
Sure. First of all, thanks for the privilege of knowledge and insight. Again, it's a bit of a distillation of the questions that come before, but you mentioned the disconnect between the education and the economic landscape, and how you used to have to, just go to high school for a good job, and have to go to high school and then college for a good job. And I want to ask what your ideas are on whether the policies need to address the education landscape or the structure of the economy in order to sort of...
So education or structure of the economy, what's the...
Both, right?
Yeah, one of the big mega facts about American society today is that, if you only have a high school degree or less, you're SOL, as they used to say in the Navy, which your dad was in. And if you have a college degree, with the exception of maybe some of our children, you're okay. Statistically, you're okay. There's a really big, it's a strange fact about American society. There's a lot of people who start college and don't get a bachelor's degree. And that's a real area to focus on in policy, is college completion, on the theory that, that will continue to pay off if people get a good education.
And I'll give a sneak preview. The May issue of the Atlantic cover story, which will be out April 17th, is about college completion rates. Last question.
Great.
First of all, thank you very much. You've been talking a lot about raising the minimum wage. I think that is a very sensible thing to do. However, when I bring that up, I'm often met with the argument that inflation will eat up a lot of the benefits from that. What can you say about that?
Oh, goodness. So, I mean, you could say that inflation has already eroded the minimum wage over the past several years. I mean, the minimum wage, if it had kept pace with inflation in 1968, would be closer to $11 today. And if it had kept pace with the gains in productivity, what the American worker is outputting vis-a-vis the profits that are being generated, it would be closer to $17 a day. So we're nowhere near a point where raising the minimum wage is going to cause that kind of issue. The other pushback people sometimes say is that it will affect job creation, but recent studies that have really controlled for minimum wage increases across county lines have debunked that and showed that it really has minimal to no job creation implications.
Well, thank you very much for all your questions. Before we conclude, I want to just make sure to recommend Mark Shriver's latest book. I know you have another one in the works, but A Good Man, which is about his dad, which is absolutely fantastic and truly moving and will make you cry. Julian Zelizer's The First Urgency of Now, about everything we've been talking about. If you want to know, if you want a great insightful, incisive primer about the Great Society era. Nick has written multiple books since then, but his book most germane to what we're talking about today is The Promised Land, about the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North, but covers a lot of the material, and since then has written books on everything ranging from the Civil War to the SAT to, so thank you for coming out on a snowy evening.